You wanted the best. You've got the best podcast. The hottest podcast in the world. The Chris Voss Show, the preeminent podcast with guests so smart you may experience serious brain bleed. The CEOs, authors, thought leaders, visionaries, and motivators. Get ready. Strap yourself in. Keep your hands, arms, and legs inside the vehicle at all times, because you're about to go on a monster education roller coaster with your brain. Now, here's your host, Chris Voss.
Hi, folks. It's Voss here from the ChrisVossShow.com, the ChrisVossShow.com. Welcome to the big show, my family friends. We certainly appreciate you guys being here. The family that loves you dearly, dearly. Much more than your mother-in-law probably does. So that's the beauty of it. Anyway, guys, we have an amazing author and journalist on the show today. I'm excited to have him. He's joining us by audio, and he's got his amazing new book out. It's called Gangbuster, One Man's Battle Against Crime, Corruption, and the Klan. Just came out March 28th, 2023. And so it's going to be interesting to talk about him on the show. He is on the show as Alan Prendergast. I imagine that's who he is. He's not on here as that, but he is. It sounded funny at the time in my head. I don't know. What can I say? Alan is the author of a true crime book, The Poison Tree, and an award-winning journalist whose work has appeared in Rolling Stone, Outside, 60 Minutes, and the Los Angeles Times, Westward, and numerous other publications and anthologies. His new book, the one we just mentioned, is an account of the life and times of Philip Van Cise. Do I have that right,
yes,
Alan? Cise, there we go. The Denver district attorney who battled mobsters in the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s when the Klan was in the process of taking political control of Colorado. Welcome to the show, Alan. How are you?
I'm great, Chris. Thanks for having me.
It's wonderful to have you as well. Give us the .coms, wherever social sites you want people to go see you on the interwebages.
The best place to go is alanprendergast.com. That's Alan with ALAN and Prendergast with that R in it, not the famous Prendergast machine. But yes, and always great to hear from readers or potential readers.
There you go. And so, this isn't your first book, to my understanding, correct?
Right. Yes, I did a true crime book about this murder case in Wyoming years ago, but that was a contemporary story. This is going back 100 years. It's a little different kind of project. Yeah.
There you go. And so what motivated you on to write this book? What brought it to your forefront?
I heard pieces of this story over time. I grew up in Denver, and this is a big missing chapter in local history, and also I think nationally, because the Klan was a national phenomenon in the 1920s, and not many people know much about how it actually operated and how it was different from the Klan we think about in the Deep South after the Civil War, or the Klan, later Klan that was bombing churches and things like that. This was a mainstream political movement, and I heard a little bit about this here and there, and I've ultimately got interested in this guy called Van Cise, who was DA for 4 years in the 1920s, just one term. But boy, he packed a lot into that term. And there was a lot going on there, and I felt like I had only a fragmentary history of it. So I sort of made a resolution to myself that I was going to find some of those missing pieces. And that's what I basically set out to do, working different archives, retracing just what happened with all this crazy stuff.
There you go.
So,
and there you go. And so you decided to write about it and tell this story that has largely been untold. I saw some of the different research on it. The Klan members walking through Denver. There was a lot of terror and hate that went on with it. Tell us a little bit about what was going on. What led up to him having to take this on locally there on the ground?
Well, he's an intriguing figure because he was, in some ways, he was from a good family, not a rich family, but it was sort of part of the establishment. And he was well known because he had been a captain in the National Guard, and then he had been a lieutenant colonel in World War I. He had a decorated officer who was in military intelligence. And he comes back to Denver after the big war and naively, perhaps to some extent, figures, well, I can run for district attorney and help do something about all this crime that we seem to be experiencing after the war. when he gets into office, he realizes that, in fact, the whole city is much more corrupt than he realized. And
Wow.
that, so the first part of the book really concerns itself with him trying to root out this corruption and this organized crime group that is operating in Denver with pretty much impunity. It's really a national network of confidence men who do the big con, where they fleece rich tourists out of hundreds of thousands of dollars, which back then, I mean, that's like millions of dollars today.
Yeah.
Um, and how he fights them is ingenious, and I don't want to give away too much, but basically he develops new ways of doing surveillance that are a little ahead of their time. I mean, in terms of electronic surveillance of criminals. And he builds a case against these guys very secretly and very painstakingly for months. And lo and behold, actually, manages to upend this gang and to some extent the power structure in the town. And he's a very popular guy. The irony is that he's then about to go to an even greater investigation, a more complex one involving the Klan. And by the time he leaves office, he's probably the most unpopular man in Colorado.
Wow.
He's it's sort of an indication of vet your candidates, or some kind of cautionary tale about that, because he was implored to run for mayor at that point. And excuse me, sorry about that. And he didn't run for mayor. The person who did run for mayor was a Klansman. Secretly. People didn't know that until after he took office and started appointing other Klansmen to various offices. So,
oh wow.
It was the corruption he'd fought to begin with now is much worse. Instead of worrying about cops who are mobbed up, he's worrying about cops who are in with the Klan.
Wow.
And it all complicates how he can do his job or not.
Yeah, because if the guys on the ground and help with the enforcement of being a DA are working for the other side, it's there's a lot of collusion going on there. It was interesting. I mean, these guys weren't just like, hey, we're just here for politics, and it was like terrorizing. They were terrorizing Catholics, Black people, all the different folks that you usually expect the Klan to go after, and they were just trying to rule by terror and domination and force.
Well, there's a lot of intimidation, and in some states it was a lot worse than Colorado. I mean, I'm talking about the level of violence, like in Texas or Indiana or Louisiana, but Colorado had one of the largest followings, and that's sort of a hard thing to explain because, historically they didn't have the racial violence of, the South, or even someplace like Oklahoma, where in the 1920s you had this massive riot in Tulsa, right? I mean, it was a racial thing going on there. But what they seem to just find ready soil here, I guess, very fertile ground for them, because they were really about being the answer to whatever the problem was. I mean, they would change their message from, we got to do something about this group, and then target a different group, the Catholics, the Jews, the Blacks, immigrants in particular. There was a lot of resentment and concern about, the immigrant population was getting larger, and we need to do something about this. These people are taking jobs away from real Americans, that whole spiel. But it was a 1920s version of that, and really there were a lot of people who felt strongly about that, or else they just saw some opportunity in the Klan, that maybe this will help my business, something like that. So that you had all kinds of people. You had this sort of real hardcore believers in white supremacy, but you also had a lot of people who were maybe small business people trying to get ahead or find some advantage.
And it seemed like there was a little bit of a kind of mafia sort of thing, like people had to make payments to them, that old.
Well, that's sort of the other side of it. The Klan portrayed itself as this big law and order thing. It was really a money-making enterprise. Van Cise was one of the few people to really start investigating it as a criminal fraud, right? I mean, they're bamboozling their own members. They're taking all kinds of money from these guys, and no one's accountable for it. Millions of dollars were being raised across the country by the various Klan enterprises, and nobody knows where the money went. I mean, it was being skimmed at various levels. Plus, they were taking kickbacks from bootleggers. I mean, these guys were saying, "Oh, we're all for prohibition," but they let crime thrive, and they took payoffs for it, just the same as if they were gangsters. So it was really not that much different from Van Sise's perspective than fighting the con men is just end up fighting the Klan as well.
Yeah, I saw a map of the KKK membership ledger residences in Denver, and it's like holy crap. The book had nearly 30,000 entries of all sorts of money laundering. It's still a mafia thing. Yeah, it's a nice business you have here. Be ashamed if something happened to it. You should buy some protection. It's that sort of corruption, and it sounds like they were all in the political sphere of mayors, judges,
Right.
police
This
officers.
happened very rapidly. I mean, Van Cise couldn't really stop them in their tracks. I mean, he did some interesting things that kept them from taking over as completely as they would have liked to.
Mhm.
But from the time that he decided not to run for mayor himself, and this other guy, Stapleton, became the mayor, within a few months, Stapleton had appointed a Klan chief of police. He'd appointed a Klan city attorney. And within a few months after that, the state Republican Party had been taken over by the Klan.
Wow.
And that was Van Cise's party. So he fought pretty hard against that. But in the elections of 24, which is, the state elections, the presidential election, all that was the Klan's high point. Particularly in Colorado, they dominated the legislature. They took over most public offices. They were very powerful. And it was obviously very dangerous for somebody like Van Cise to be on the outs with them and trying to figure out ways to indict them.
Yeah. And so what made this man have this sort of semblance of character? Because, even today in politics, we don't see a lot of bravery and courage. We see a lot of, well, I don't want to go against what the party says or who
Right.
elected me or, anything that's not politically, anything that's morally expedient doesn't seem to be politically expedient. What made this gentleman, have that sort of character?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. And, I spent some time going into his own background and his family. He was very influenced by his father, who was a progressive fellow, a lawyer, a minister, and very high moral standards. And I think he had taught Van Cise from a very early age to stand up for what is right. And although he and his father didn't see eye to eye on everything, he really, I think, absorbed that lesson. And he was
Mm.
fearless. He had, even before he became DA, he had been in a situation as a member of the National Guard where he had to sort of blow the whistle on some of his fellow guardsmen after this violent confrontation with striking miners that became known as the Ludlow Massacre.
Oh yeah.
This was about 1914, and Van Cise was not part of that confrontation, but he was sent down by the governor to investigate it, and he recommended that various fellow guardsmen be court-martialed and that one of them be tried for murder for shooting a prisoner in the back. And that didn't make him any friends. It got him. He resigned from the Guard shortly after because all this stuff was whitewashed as far as he was concerned.
Wow.
But that gave him a reputation as a guy who just, he's going to go his own way and he's going to call you out if you do something wrong. And I think that really was a formative experience for him. And when he comes to face the Klan later, he's not exactly intimidated by these guys.
There you go. Why do you feel this story hasn't been widely told and researched much? Is it kind of just one of those dark things where people are like, yeah, we really don't want to talk about that in our history?
Well, I think that's part of it. I mean, I think Van Cise was kind of a reminder of a time when a lot of politicians in this town, prominent people, got their start, under a sheet here with the Klan, and
Wow.
people didn't want to be reminded about that. The interesting thing, you mentioned the ledger. I mean, the ledger survives to this day, and you can actually go online now at History Colorado, and if you had relatives in Denver in the 1920s, you could put in their name and see if they were Klans people.
Wow.
If they were official card-carrying members of the Klan. You don't have that in many states. I mean, most of those records were destroyed a long time ago. Every state tried to sort of cover up this chapter of their past. I think only in recent years are we looking at it more closely, and that was one reason I think the Van Cise story suddenly comes to the fore. It's been suppressed for so long, but it's actually a story about, someone standing up in a dark time and doing the right thing.
There you go. And these are the stories that I love in human history, and this is why we have a lot of historians like yourself that come on the show and help enlighten and educate people on history and what's gone before, because to me, I mean, we still see that these issues aren't resolved, or these issues of hate and loathing, or blaming the immigrant, and pointing the finger at, well, this person's responsible for your problems, well, they're stealing from your pocketbook.
Yeah.
And we seem to not learn these lessons, and they keep repeating and recycling themselves. We saw this in politics recently with there's the Charlottesville, the Jews will not replace us people that went out, the racists that went out, and I think they were KKK, Nazism, I think, but they were doing that whole bit, and you're like, you talk about this happening in 1920, this is happening in this is happening in 2017 or 2016.
Sure.
And you're like, wow, man, we haven't learned much over. And it's the same sort of bid argument that politicians will try and sell to separate, divide, and conquer. And it's always amazing to me that as a people, we don't sit at human beings and go, hey, we saw that movie in 1920, or pick your date.
Yeah, no, that's
we
a
learned
good
that lesson.
observation. The as I was doing this, I kept, without necessarily seeking it out, I kept finding parallels to things in our own experience. That's for sure. The Klan had its own newspapers. It had some radio stations. If you were a true believer in the Klan, you could spend all your time in your own echo chamber listening to these conspiracy theories about how Catholics were trying to take over the world, or the plans for Jewish domination, and some of this stuff coming out of anti-Semite tracts from Tsarist Russia, right? I mean, it's been around for years, and it's just being recycled. Yeah. And it was being done for the same reasons. One of the most trenchant things I came across was actually a quote from LBJ. This is 40 years after the Klan in the 20s, right? Mm-hmm. And he's observing to a colleague, he's saying, if you tell the lowest white man that he's better than the best black man, he won't notice that you're picking his pocket. That describes the Klan in a nutshell. That's exactly the kind of misdirection they were up to. They were peddling hate as a way of finding someone to blame for something, and they were making money off it. Yeah. I mean, that was really what it was all about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sort of politics goes back to, the beginning of time, Greek, Romans. You can go. It's just astounding to me. I always use the phrase it's a quote from me. That's the one thing man can learn from his history is that man never learns from his history, and thereby we go round and round. And so that's why I love books like yours and stories like yours, because they bring a light to it. And then we need to champion these heroes. We need to champion it, and usually we're good about that. We're good at but sometimes we let it get really freaking ugly before we decide that, hey, well, it's time for the hero journey there, and we should have the hero come out and save the day, at the darkest point of no return. And we need to just get better, I think, as a human race at seeing stuff ahead of time and going, this doesn't end well. History's taught us that,
Right. Well, the problem is, I think heroes are sometimes inconvenient. We want them at the right moment when there's a crisis. Yeah. But they can be, to be as blunt as Van Cise was a liability in a lot of situations. I mean, there were times when possibly he could have been a little more tactful, or a little less, inflexible in his own views, and maybe he could have built a stronger coalition against the Klan, that kind of thing. But that isn't who he was, and that isn't who these guys tend to be. So, I mean, we can welcome them when we want them, but we don't always want them around.
Yeah. I mean, you look at somebody like Churchill, and the bravery and stuff. But, before that, they didn't want him. They sent him home. Exactly. And said, nah, we're done with your shit. And then, oh, hey, can you come back and save us for this this Nazi dude? And then after that, hey, oh, thanks for winning the war. Hey, you know what? We're done with you again.
Again, yes. Put him out to pasture. That's kind of what happened with Van Cise. I mean, he really, any future political career he could have had, I think, was pretty much gone by the number of people he managed to alienate or alarm with his attacks on the Klan. But I don't think he would have changed any of that. I mean, he had no regrets about what he was doing.
And one of the, in particular with his story and other stories like his, where they stand up against immense, they're going to make enemies of friends, and they're probably going to risk losing it all. They're probably going to risk losing their future, maybe aspirations of political things like you mentioned, and they're willing to doing what's right and what's just is more important than that, and they sacrifice themselves on that altar. And I think that's why it's important, like stories like yours. Again, I say that we need to recognize these people and value them, and then also learn from the history of what that should have taught us.
Well, and in this case, I don't want to you know, overemphasize it, but what started out in some ways as him, legitimately pursuing what he thought were criminal inquiries about a group that didn't seem to him completely, following the Constitution. It became increasingly a liability for him. I mean, he was physically threatened. There were situations he was in that could have gone much worse than they did. They tried to kidnap him one night.
Wow.
He carried a gun for the last part of his year in office. And this is not the Wild West anymore, but it's these are the people you want to meet in a dark street, right? So I mean, there was, in addition to sacrificing his career, there was great personal risk to him and to some extent to his family in what he was doing. But he didn't back down. I mean, I think he always felt that one of the ways you were going to beat these guys was to not give in an inch to any of their threats or anything like that.
And I imagine he had a family, a wife, and kids, didn't he too?
Yes, he did. And there's a famous story. This is sort of near the end of this whole thing, where he's supposed to give a talk at a Memorial Day service for the veterans and the dead of World War I and previous wars. And the Klan does a parade that day. One of the pictures in the book you mentioned, I mean, there's a Klan parade in downtown Denver with these guys in their robes. And Van Cise takes the occasion of this speech to criticize these guys and say, they have no business marching on a Veterans Day, with the sacrifices that the military has made. That this day is for them. It's not for these bozos in white suits. And they were so upset with that. They wanted to, get back at him some way. They burned a cross on his lawn.
Wow.
And his kids remember from those years, that they were young enough that they thought, well, this is like 4th of July, just came early. Wow, this is pretty. This thing, I don't know. The point is that Van Cise and his whole family jeered at them over this. It's like, this is the best you got. You come back, you want to just vandalize my property. That's it. And it's an amazing moment that signals in a way just how the Klan no longer had the fear factor that it had before. I mean, the burning cross was supposed to be like the biggest threat they could make, right? And Van Cise is just saying, "Oh, I'm sorry I wasn't home when you did that. Try it again. I'll be there waiting for you. Give you a warm welcome.
I'll send you a calendar link. We'll set an appointment."
Exactly.
I mean, it does take bravery. I mean, I've always been able to fight the battles that I want to fight because I don't have a wife and kids. But if you have a family, you're that kind of weighs on your decision making. And
well, I think it did influence him deciding not to run for DA again. I mean, I don't think he would have won anyway because the Klan by that point was rigging the elections. But that's another story.
There you go. It's wild, the ride that goes on with everything. What do you hope people learn from the book?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, this is our history. It's a chapter we should acknowledge, not just in Colorado, but I mean, this was happening across the country in some unlikely places. It was obviously not as strong in the Northeast, but there were certainly lots of places in the Midwest, the West, the Southwest, where the Klan did terrible things. And there were various people who made accommodations to the Klan, and this should be looked at, and we should learn from that. And I think also, we do recognize something of ourselves when we go back to these stories. We see things about the way extremist movements operate and the way they try to soft pedal some of these things in order to get a wider audience. I think some of the same things are going on today. And, it's an education to think about how self-serving some of this stuff was. And, there may have been a lot of rhetoric there about patriotism or whatever, but a lot of these guys were in it for the money. And that's also something to keep in mind.
Yeah, it always seems to come down to that bottom line, doesn't it? I mean,
I don't think there's anybody in American politics that isn't thinking about their own interests at some point, right?
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, it's not people aren't just like, hey, I'm just going to do some corruption. Well, is there any money in it? Nah, I'm just going to do it just to do it. It just seemed like a fun thing to do. I don't know. Maybe there are criminals that operate from that aspect. But no, it's like you say, the historical nature of it is to run a scam, run money, make money, get power, get success. And thank God there are people like this, because when you read stories like yours and his, you realize that if there weren't people that stood up and put themselves in the line of fire, I mean, you can tell lots of stories of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy and different other people who paid for their lives, who were martyred for their cause. Um, and these were dangerous times, and you have to sit and look and go, what if there hadn't been these people that stood the line, that held the line? What if they had one? You can even look at January 6th. One of the most haunting memories I have of January 6th is seeing that damn ass Confederate flag in the building, the
Yeah.
U.S. government building. To see that flag in there that had never been anywhere near that building before during the Confederacy made me realize how unresolved these issues are and how they are still playing themselves out. So I like book like yours, because they, like you said, they take us back and remind
Yeah.
us.
Well, I told you I sort of went in search of missing pieces. One of the pieces I found, which has a bearing on this January 6th thing, was the actual speech that Van Cise was supposed to deliver. This is shortly before the elections. He had prepared a whole presentation for the public on what the Klan was up to, who was secretly a Klansman, all this stuff. It was like a PowerPoint. I mean, he had like these lantern slides he was going to project on a screen. This is 1923, right? He never got to deliver this speech, but I found a copy of it in an archive. And so I finally figured out what he was trying to say. What happened that night was that the Klan packed the hall. They got there before anybody else. The police let them in. There were 4,000 Klansmen in this audience instead of the voting public he hoped to find. And so they shouted him down, and he continued to try to present this for 5 hours, could barely get a word out because they were drowning him out and screaming at him. And this was a near riot in the city auditorium in Denver. But seeing this speech really filled in some gaps to me, because it showed me what he was trying to say that nobody at the time heard that night. I mean, it's not in the newspaper reports because it was unintelligible what he was trying to do. Here's the whole case he wanted to make. It's really, it was really satisfying to find that.
And this was kind of a real fight during this time. How close was it to being like Chicago? I mean, where you had Al Capone and evidently there was one central figure you talk about in the book who I think it was Lou Blonger.
Yes. Yeah, he was the Al Capone. Well, not as ruthless as Al Capone. I mean, he didn't kill people routinely, but he was the fixer in Denver. He was a Denver institution. He was the head of these con man operation that Van Cise took down. But yeah, I mean, that was an important turning point to me. Was Denver was going the way of some other major cities at those times, Chicago, Kansas City. And really, Van Cise helped turn the course of things. And so that I think it had a little different outcome because he had worked so hard at exposing this corruption. Yes, the Klan came in. Yes, the Klan fell apart almost just as fast. And I think Denver was on a different track, thanks to Van Cise and some of the people who were also resisting this stuff. So it was a turning point for me. I mean, I think that there's no question the city altered its course to some extent thanks to what he did.
Yeah, probably a good thing too. I mean, we see over the history of our country, we've seen these tests of the rule of law and the Constitution. And I'm not an attorney, but I've spent enough looking over law and defending my companies. I mean, in courtrooms or suing people in courtrooms. You people don't realize how important the power of that is. The rule of law, the thing that one man is not against it, and well, criminals tend to test it over the centuries that this small republic has been around, or this new republic has been around. How important that is, keeping us from just becoming all out chaos and stuff. And so these battles set a precedence for the future and in law, and also to other people who bring jurisprudence to our legal system to ensure that everyone's held accountable. At least that's what it's supposed to be.
Well, to Van Sice's credit, this really was about his adherence to the rule of law. He was surrounded by people who just were trying to find the most convenient way to go along to get along. And this included judges. I mean, one of his biggest enemies when he was fighting the Klan was a district judge who was trying to pack the grand jury with Klansmen. Imagine a grand jury full of Klansmen indicting whoever they choose, right? I mean, that's crazy. But Van Sice was getting locked out of his own jury room, and he fought this guy tooth and nail, because what he was doing was illegal. I mean, it's not a question of ideology at some point. The Klan had set out to try to recruit him early on because it's like, hey, he's a Republican. He's a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. He's perfect for us. Mm-hmm. And, there were things about his ideology that may have been comfortable to the Klan, but there was no way he was going to go with this organization. And he became, they went from trying to recruit him to trying to destroy him in very short order. The guy who was that judge became the governor, the Klan governor, and ultimately ended up in Leavenworth, which is another story. But
oh wow,
all these guys were so wholly corrupt. It was incredible.
There you go. There was a lot of that going on in this kind of conversion from the Wild West to trying to have a organized union. The Mormons had that problem when the U.S. government sent the military in. They couldn't get they couldn't get prosecutions for crimes in the federal bench because they would fill the docket with Mormons who wouldn't prosecute each other. And so rape, murder, robbery, everything was going on, and no jury would convict because it was just out of control.
Well, it was the same thing here with the Klan. Was basically the juries were getting stacked with Klansmen. You couldn't convict a Klansman of a crime, and that was very concerning. You have to somewhere take a stand against that, or your whole justice system just goes down the tubes.
There you go. Well, it's great to celebrate the men who stand forth and say enough of the bullshit, and trying to uphold what's right and what's necessary in the rule of law, because it separates us from becoming a medieval dark times culture where just marauders go from building to building and do whatever they want, whoever has the most power. So anything more, Alan, you want to share with us or tease out on the book before we go?
I keep coming back to that speech on Memorial Day. It's one of the moments in this whole story that made me feel it was worth doing, because what he essentially told the audience, in addition to criticizing the Klan for their parade, was saying, we're in a battle right now that's as important as any of the battles we ever fought in the Great War or in the Civil War. It's a battle for Americanism. It's a battle about who gets to decide who's an American and who isn't. Mm-hmm. And, that struck me as being so right on about who the Klan was and what they were trying to do and how they were trying to divide people and basically disenfranchise half the country, basically. Mm-hmm. It sort of stays with me, and you can understand why it upset the Klan as much as it did.
Yeah.
He was basically calling them out.
And that's awesome, man. So great story here. Brilliant journalism. Give us your .com so people can find you on the interwebs, please.
It's alanprendergast.com, AlanPrendergast. And yes, you can contact me there. I always love to hear from readers and any questions. That's great.
There you go. The things you learn from history, and we triumph these many times. We try to triumph these people who stood up against tyranny, oppression, and people that try to do whatever they want. And usually, hopefully, we remember them and celebrate them, because they stand between us and the marauders at the door. So this is really important, and it's the fight over this nation. When it says "we the people" in the Constitution, that means everybody, or it's supposed to. Let's put it that way. But we're was it Obama said, we zig and we zag. We're constantly a nation in search of a more perfect union, but you never achieve perfection. It's always a thing, and it's interesting when you study the history of this country, the tussle that goes on to achieve that perfect union, whatever that may be, that all men may have the same rights, and everyone can, live life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thank you very much, Alan, for coming on the show. We really appreciate it.
Hey, Chris, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
There you go. Thank you. Order the book, folks. Wherever fine books are sold, you can go to Amazon or other places. Gangbuster, One Man's Battle Against Crime, Corruption, and the Klan. We need more people like Mr. Philip Van Cise. Order up March 28th, 2023. It became available. And thanks for tuning in. Go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss, youtube.com/Chris Voss, linkedin.com/Chris Voss, and all those great places on the internet. Thanks for tuning in. Be good to each other. Stay safe. And we'll see you guys